Hey, good morning, everyone. This working? All right, awesome. Hey, Dawn, how are you? Good morning. Can you see me okay?
Cody. I can see you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Awesome.
Awesome.
How's everyone doing? We're going to keep this very informal this morning. I feel a little bit bad anytime I do this because there's been so much optimism in the room the last 2 days talking about, disruption and the future of this technology. And then we're going to talk about Washington and bring us all down to earth a little bit. I think it's really interesting, Dawn. The title of this panel is Will Crypto Be Regulated? And I think that's interesting for two reasons, and I would love to get your perspective. One, I think it assumes that crypto isn't regulated right now, which I know we'll get into, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think it's imperfect, but there is some regulatory guardrails right now. And the second reason is that when you think of crypto and the genesis of digital assets and Bitcoin, it's kind of anti-government, right? I mean, you want to free yourself from government intervention. If you read the Bitcoin white paper, there's a libertarian slant there. And so we talk about regulation and trying to address that, just natural conflict between regulation and digital assets and crypto. So, Dawn, I want to start there. Is crypto regulated? What is, big picture, what is the current regulatory landscape of crypto right now?
Yeah, thanks, Cody. And I'm so disappointed that I'm not there with you in person, but I'm certain that you're going to manage the stage perfectly without me. I completely agree with you that we do have this really interesting, we're sort of at this interesting crossroads where many of these products were developed in response to interest in having less intervention from the government. Unfortunately, though, as anything matures to a point that there are implications for consumers or investors, the government inevitably will come to take note. And frankly, I think that perhaps we should start there. Various regulators have attempted to apply their current regulatory protections in the digital asset space. And frankly, I think they should be commended for using the tools in their toolbox to deter fraud or prevent market manipulation or stop illicit activity. But because those protections were developed in a very different context than the application of some of the technology we're seeing today, they're not always a perfect fit. And in some cases, they're not a fit at all. And I think that most people would agree, perhaps not the authors of the original white paper, but I think most people would agree that the crypto marketplace and the utility of blockchain technology has matured to a point that perhaps a more cohesive and well understood and clearer regulatory framework should be encouraged across the U.S. government. And I think that's where we are. Companies are facing an unprecedented demand for these products and the services that support them. And those who are serious about deploying such offerings know that they'll benefit from regulatory compliance that will lend to customer confidence. But those same companies can't succeed if the regulatory expectations are unknown. And today, I think there's a lot of unknowns, and that is where I think we have a dire need for clarity in the United States.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The need for clarity is something that you hear so often from different companies who are getting in this space. Who should be the regulator for digital assets is a really tough and broad question because, as the Biden administration in their executive order, they launched a whole of government approach to crypto because it falls across so many different agencies. But the real debate that we hear when it comes to crypto is the CFTC versus the SEC. Is what I'm issuing a security? Is it a commodity? So I would love to get your perspective, as you've just recently sat on the CFTC, how those two agencies are working to carve out their own, regulatory jurisdiction in crypto. And maybe a follow-up to that, if you're a company in this space, where do you look? What should you be doing to make sure that you're in compliance with the current proposals that are out there now and with the current regulatory guidelines right now?
Yeah, that's a lot. Unfortunately, we don't have an hour, but I will try to address as much of that as possible. And you're right. I think these are all the questions that people are rightfully asking. So we've already established there's a lot of confusion out there. Stakeholders have begun raising that confusion with their members of Congress. I mean, they are constituents to Congress, and Congress is now responding by, as they should, by saying, hey, we need to partner with the administration and partner with the regulatory agencies and try to inject a bit more clarity. Unfortunately, there are competing pieces of legislation, and by competing, I don't mean that they're couldn't be aligned, but as is the case often with developing legislation to better inform regulators, it takes some time because there are different ideas on the table and they all need to be reconciled. And that's where we are. That's a very, I think, proper way for the United States government to be responding. Constituents tell their members of Congress, Congress begins developing solutions, and it's just going to take time to determine which regulators should play what role and most effectively. But unfortunately, what further complicates these things are that we're not starting with a blank slate. And as you pointed out, Cody, there are already market regulators who have authority and have claimed authority over some activities in these markets. And the existing market regulation being applied to this new market act, to this new asset class, in some cases, there are clear lines of jurisdictional separation among the U.S. market regulators. And when I say U.S. market regulators, I am referring to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission. But there are also some blurry lines because many of these new products don't cleanly fit into the current structure as we've already established. So I'll just give an example. The CFTC, where I used to work, is already and has for a number of years been regulating Bitcoin futures. But the CFTC does not today have a clear mandate or authority to regulate the spot market for cash Bitcoin, nor arguably does the SEC. So this is why Congress is having this conversation. This is why the Financial Stability Oversight Council recommended to Congress in their recent report that they look at how logically to instruct the market regulators to regulate the spot market, because it's not clear that all spot market assets are covered under current regulatory authorities of the CFTC or the SEC. And no one, I think there has been some confusion. No one is suggesting that we're going to take legacy authorities away from the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. No one's suggesting that the SEC will cease to be the regulator of securities, including digital assets that may be determined to be securities. There are a lot of questions about how digital assets fit into that definition of securities. But I think rather what's under consideration is a much more narrow response, which is how do we regulate those spot crypto assets that are not securities? And all signs seem to be pointing to the CFTC having a role in that oversight. But the regulators need help from Congress in a way that new authorities, they need to be provided new authorities to address these gaps, but they also need help from Congress in refining their current authorities to ensure that the existing rules are fit for purpose so that we're not trying to fit square pegs into round holes, which has occurred, and it's simply not helpful to the investors or the innovators or for the integrity of the market or the integrity of a regulatory program. So ultimately, I think the framework will end up being a hybrid. It will apply some of the legacy protections and some new parameters that are more well suited to the current market application. I mean, we don't need to build an entirely new vehicle here. I mean, we can keep the seatbelts and the airbags, but maybe we can't retrofit the Tesla with the parts from the Oldsmobile. We just need some rules of the road so that everybody has a level playing field.
You mentioned Congress and some of the different proposals that have been introduced this Congress to delegate more authority to the CFTC. to regulate crypto and virtual currencies. And in 2015, the CFTC said, hey, Bitcoin and Ether and other virtual currencies are commodities. When you talk to a lot of people in town right now, though, and Gary Gensler, chairman of the SEC, says, okay, leave Bitcoin alone. 99% of all tokens are securities, and I should be the primary regulator. And a lot of people in the industry are advocating for the CFTC to be that primary regulator, and even Congress in some of those legislative proposals are, as I said, are trying to get more authority to the CFTC to be the primary regulator. Why does it make sense for the CFTC to be the primary regulator in this space? 80% of the market cap have been deemed commodities. That's one reason. But why do you think it makes sense for the CFTC to really lead here?
Yeah, well, I think the CFTC and the SEC, I think we have to start with their, they approach regulation somewhat differently. And not because they choose to do so, but because their statutes that Congress has already provided to them have instructed them to regulate differently. The CFTC is what we would call a principle-based regulator. And what that means is that Congress sets out a set of core principles for all of the types of entities the CFTC regulates. And they're pretty general. And Congress told the CFTC, these are the parameters. Now you go design some rules, but make sure that they are flexible enough that they can apply to a variety of different types of products. So the CFTC then writes rules that are continue to be principle-based, and then those entities that are required to regulate or register with the CFTC have to design a rule book. And at each of these stages, the obligations become a little more granular, but it's designed so that each entity that may register with the CFTC doesn't have to comply with a set of very prescriptive requirements. And that's a tough job when you sit at the CFTC. Some people have suggested this makes the CFTC a more relaxed regulator. I maintain that that's quite the opposite. If you're going to apply a principle-based regulation and you're going to permit the registrants to prove to you that they can comply, but they all may be complying in a slightly different way. If they fail to meet their compliance obligations that they committed to in their own unique way, the CFTC's enforcement division will find you very quickly and explain to you why you have not done it in the way you were obligated to do, and you'll probably end up paying a fairly large fine. So I think principle-based regulation has a real place in this market, and because it's evolving, and so we need some flexibility to preserve and structure. And that's why I think the CFTC is under consideration, as is the SEC, to continue regulating securities in the way they've regulated securities for a number of years. And that is, it's slightly more prescriptive. And I think that's why the conversation often leads to which regulator is preferred. The reality is, if the product is determined to be a security, the Securities and Exchange Commission will regulate it. The CFTC is not even, the CFTC by statute is precluded from regulating securities. So determining whether something is a security or not is the first step. Beyond that, the CFTC today can't regulate the spot market. But if Congress chooses to give them authority over the spot market, because again, these things just aren't fitting in the securities bucket, I think it's largely not due to the fact that they may be commodities, but due to the fact that the culture of the CFTC is perhaps more welcoming of innovation and more flexible.
I'm really glad you said that and you laid that out, because I think a lot of people just assume that this is the conversation and the debate to give the CFTC more authority in this space is just personality driven. They don't like who is leading the SEC because of his statements, and they like who's leading the CFTC. But I think it's so much more than that. And I think if it was that argument alone, it would be pretty short-sighted. I think people forget that Gary Gensler was the CFTC chairman at one point, and so you never know these are, temporary positions, so you never know who is going to be leading from the top. So that personality angle, I think, is pretty short-sighted. Dawn, I want to take a step back a little.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, Dawn, I want to take a step back a little bit. This industry is complicated. As you know, we learned today over the last 2 days, there are so many new terms to try to understand, and acronyms. There's a lot of acronyms in this space. And you know, it's really hard to get. It's a foreign language for many, and it's a foreign language for regulators right now. And you know, organizations like mine are working with regulators and policymakers to help bridge that educational gap. So I'm curious, you know, when you were at the CFTC and even now, like, how did you educate yourself on, you know, this industry and these technologies, and how are other policymakers doing that?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and you're exactly right. There is a learning curve at any agency, at any point in the government. You know, those who have jobs in the U.S. government did not probably. Most of them did not take the job to regulate digital assets. They took the job to regulate oil futures or public companies or, you know, illicit activity in, you know, associated with terrorism. And now some of the things that the utility and the challenges associated with digital assets are now really perplexing to regulators, if I can. It actually can become a full-time job. I have to say, I was at the CFTC for 4 years. When I started, we talked about digital assets, but it was mostly in the context of fraudulent activity and where we might be bringing enforcement cases. By the time I left the CFTC, every speaking engagement I was asked to participate in had some element of, you know, cryptocurrency, digital assets, blockchain. It really was, within 4 years, regulators were kind of learning on the job, if you will, but also being expected to respond in a way that required engagement with the industry to best understand. So the CFTC and the SEC both have innovation offices. They're called different things. And at the onset, those offices were places where innovators could come and explain what they might be designing and how it might benefit the marketplace that the CFTC or the SEC was responsible for regulating. And that was a remarkable source of information. I can say at the CFTC, that office would often come and brief the commissioners about the events that were occurring. And frankly, it was usually a positive conversation. I know some have been concerned that they would come to the agency to educate and quickly find themselves in trouble with the enforcement division. I don't think that happened that often at the CFTC, frankly. I think we were very hungry for the information. And oftentimes, if there was enforcement repercussions, it didn't come from the Office of Innovation. It came from a whistleblower. So those were interesting times. Those offices have now transitioned to be more policy development driven because, just like the marketplace, the regulator has matured to the point that, you know, they continue to need the educational aspect, but they really mostly need to focus on developing new policies. And so I like to thank the industry for coming to the CFTC and helping us. And I also wanted to note that the Financial Stability Oversight Council's recent report designated the Financial Literacy Education Commission to lead and coordinate public awareness efforts. So this is the external education piece. And I think that's really important too. I spent a lot of time when I was at the CFTC making sure the public understood the bounds of our authorities and what we could and could not do. And I think that's really important that there be some element of consumer education. But I also think we're to the point now that the regulators need to educate those who are innovating. I think all regulatory agencies, quite frankly, have an obligation to educate not only the general public, but those who may be implicated by regulatory obligations. And regulators, I think, should engage in their own maybe public awareness campaign to explain how their existing regulatory structure may encompass the unique structure that's supporting the digital asset space. I really do think that's an obligation of the regulator.
That's a great point. I love that you said, you know, at the end of your term, you know, almost all of your speaking engagements were, somewhat related to digital assets. And I think it shows that digital assets really are in the mainstream in Washington. Over 71 bills, I believe, 71 exactly, 71 bills introduced this Congress on digital assets. Some of those have a better chance in the long run and are more comprehensive. And I'm curious, Dawn, out of those bills, or, and even the executive order, the Biden administration's executive order on digital assets, where does Washington go from here? Like, what do we tackle first? Because I feel like it's been so much talk, and it's hard to really dissect all of that, and not a lot of action, but a lot of talk and, proposals. What happens next? I know it's an impossible question, but I'm going to toss it to you.
No, it's not impossible. It's just, I think you said it at the onset of the discussion. I feel like our panel's a negative panel, and I don't want to be negative, but I think I need to level set with the fact that this is going to take a lot of time. So prior to my work at the CFTC, I was a congressional staffer in the Senate, and I happened to be there during the development of Dodd-Frank. It was a terrible time to be designing regulation in the midst of a crisis. So I will say that I think Congress knows that they need to develop some parameters around this new market, if you will, or new and new utility of the market, if you will. And I think they know they need to do it in advance of any crises, because many members of Congress were there during the 2007-2008 years where we had a financial crisis, and there were many considerations of how to move forward and how best to design a regulatory structure in response to the crisis. That's a terrible way to legislate, and it's a terrible way to regulate when you're in the middle of a crisis. So I think everyone has acknowledged we're better served to design some parameters in advance of anything that might go wrong terribly. And that's where we are. There, like I said, there are many, many, many pieces of legislation. All of those will have pieces of all of those. They ultimately end up in whatever becomes law. And that reconciliation process is what takes time. So I do not think we will see any legislation in 2022. I think 2023 will be the time in which things are filtered to a point of determining, what makes it into legislation. And I think, frankly, it will be comprehensive legislation. There may be pieces out of the congressional committee that has oversight over the CFTC, and pieces that come from the committee that has oversight of the SEC or the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Department. And at that point, there will be a leap of faith. Congress will say, we think we got it right, and now we're going to hand it over to the regulators. And the regulators will design some rules. Rules take time because by law, rules have to be developed with public input. And sometimes public input takes 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 180 days to receive comments. And then after that, everything goes live. When things go live in the context of, a new regulator for, let's say, an exchange that's offering a cash crypto product like Bitcoin, those entities are going to have to come register. That registration process will take time. There will be many, many, many conversations with the exchange offerer, the infrastructure provider, and the agency, and there will be refinements to their application. Anyway, that's all to say this is going to take some time. And in the meantime, I recognize it's really hard to be an innovator and to maintain your zeal about, your product when everything in Washington's moving slowly. I mean, this marketplace is moving fast and Washington's moving slowly. And in the interim, there's going to be a lot of frustration. And that is unfortunate. But I do think that talking to members of Congress about the urgency of getting this done is the place where people can have the most effective influence currently.
I agree with you completely. It's going to take time, and we have already seen the detrimental impact of that. Some of the big companies in this space who are desperate for regulatory clarity have decided to look elsewhere. They've moved overseas. I mean, FTX, one of the largest exchanges in this space, is now headquartered in the Bahamas because of the regulatory environment. So we're starting to see other jurisdictions move forward because they see the opportunity of the U.S. moving slowly. We had a member of the European Union come in, a politician from the European Union, and came in and talked to our organization not too long ago and some members of Congress and said, we missed out on Web 2. You know, the internet boom and, you know, went to Silicon Valley, and we missed out on, you know, the Googles and the Facebooks being headquartered in the EU. We're not going to miss out on Web 3. And so there's a competitiveness angle here. And I'm curious how you think about that and how regulators and policymakers are thinking about that competitiveness angle when they're trying to devise policy.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that to date, many U.S. regulators have only focused on what I call the protection part of their job and not the promotional part of their job. So at the CFTC, where I used to work, the mission by statute basically is prevent market manipulation and protect customers. And then there's a third prong that sometimes gets left out of the discussion, which is promote innovation and competition. And historically, I think the U.S. has led the way in establishing some regulatory expectations, and I'm certain that they are quite active in many global forums, such as the Financial Stability Board, who put out some recommendations last week, or the International Organization of Security Commissions, where the CFTC and the SEC are both involved. But here at home, the U.S. has largely relied on existing regulatory regimes, where some smaller jurisdictions have been quick to adopt entirely new frameworks that are tailored to the digital asset market. And the result is that utility and demand has continued to grow, and it's really outpaced U.S. Regulatory response. And not that all U.S. regulations on the books are ill-fitted, but some of them are. And we need to make sure that those ill-fitted rules are not creating compliance vulnerabilities. And I think that's what you're talking about. Many companies are so scared of the compliance, of running afoul of their obligations, because what they want to do doesn't nicely fit into the regulatory structure, that they've just looked elsewhere. But you know what? U.S. citizens are not going to discontinue their interest in these products. So the U.S. government needs to balance this protection and innovation and quickly lay out a framework to address both. And I'd be interested, Cody, from your perspective. I mean, you talk to a lot of companies, and you know, these are global markets, and they're lasting structures that often develop in response to regulatory first movers. So while the U.S. continues to consider the path forward and these smaller jurisdictions have created entirely new frameworks, other major economies, like you mentioned, Europe, are putting in place a comprehensive legislation process to govern the framework. And I'd be curious to know if you think U.S. regulators become regulatory takers as opposed to regulatory makers once the market begins to build around a new European, structure.
I think it's possible. You know, when we talk to our companies and they come in, they say, listen, we're driving on the road, and we want to continue driving on the road, and we want to follow all the rules of the road. But right now in the U.S., there's no speed limit, and we're just getting pulled over, and we have no idea what to do. There's just no clarity at all. And that's frustrating. And their fear is that when they go into U.S. regulators, as you mentioned earlier, they're going to go in and, say, hey, here's what we want, here's the clarity that we want, and then that's going to leave them open for an enforcement action. And it's a sad way to go about it and to think about it. So when they look to other jurisdictions that are moving more quickly, it may be imperfect. The European Union's recent MiCA law that they're going to pass, it may be imperfect, and there's a lot of things wrong with it, but they're saying, you know what? I'd rather know the rules so I can follow that guidance and make sure I'm in compliance so I don't get an enforcement action. Even if it's imperfect, I'm willing to go work over there versus the U.S., where I'm just in no man's land. And that's really scary right now.
Yeah. No, it is really scary. And I do think that there is I've heard too that there are other jurisdictions who are very anxious to embrace
Yeah.
to develop this market so that they can be the home for the market. The reality is the market's global. So regulators who get serious quickly about designing regulations may impose may have an upper hand in the design of the market structure.
And let me ask you about that. Regulators, global regulators talking to one another. Crypto at its core is, borderless. And so it's really hard in the US to just think about regulating in our own borders when payments are going to other jurisdictions constantly and people are communicating with each other and transacting across borders. So how are regulators, from different jurisdictions communicating with each other on this issue or other issues?
Yeah, so I think the standard setting bodies that the US regulators belong to are sort of the front line of, I call it regulatory therapy. I had the occasion to occasionally represent the CFTC on the board of the International Organization of Securities Commissions. And it's a really thoughtful body, and they do design technical standards that can help, that they can all agree to try to have some commonality in how they apply a variety of regulatory expectations. So that's where the conversations are most likely happening. And with the financial stability regulators, the Financial Stability Board is another standard setting body. That process, though, I think we talked earlier about how regulators were learning and regulators were trying to understand this new marketplace. I think that's true all around the world. I do think that it's the regulations have developed to a point now that those bodies are probably able to draw upon a variety of either proposals or implemented reforms to regulations. But the United States is a little behind here. So we have to determine what role the US plays in those conversations. And believe me, I know they're heavily engaged and involved. But as they have the conversations, it has to be acknowledged that other jurisdictions have already put regulations in place. I'm not sure if anyone in this audience was around when the CFTC or was involved when the CFTC implemented their version, their authorities under the Dodd-Frank Act, but they went ahead of everyone else. The CFTC wrote their regulations long before Europe, long before the SEC. And in some regards, they were the first movers, and the industry built around that. And so I do think that it will be hard to redesign a regulatory structure for a global marketplace after other jurisdictions have set forth what they think is prudent.
Don, let me go back to the Biden administration. They have made digital assets a focus of their agenda. In last March, we saw the executive order on digital assets that created this whole of government approach. And then more recently, last month, we've seen a lot of reports come out of that executive order. The tone and tenor was, I would say pretty pessimistic overall as it relate to digital assets. It was a lot of that, there's a lot of fraud. It was very enforcement focused. What was your reaction to some of those reports that came out?
Yeah, my reaction is there needs to be a central U.S. government conversation, and I think the effort is worthwhile. I do think that there needs to be more conversation about the potential and how we advance the potential. But the reality is regulatory agencies tend to focus on the wrongdoing. It is just a natural, it's sort of in their DNA that's what they do. And so to the extent that, the Biden administration is engaging with a lot of regulatory agencies, they're independent from the White House, but when they come to the table, they do all have a lot of stories about terrible things that have happened. in this space. And so my reaction is, maybe a little more balance. The agencies themselves, inside each individual agency, there seems to be a little tension about this as well. What takes precedent, promotion and innovation, or protection and prevention? And I think that every commissioner at the CFTC cares deeply about, tamping down wrongdoing and helping the market to advance without the baggage of the illicit activity. And frankly, that's why they all should work hand in hand. The prevention and the promotion are all kind of interwoven. And I think that, I hope that that's how the individual commissioners at the regulatory agencies are approaching the task. I do think it's positive that as a result of the executive order that the Financial Stability Oversight Council put out their own recommendations last 2 weeks, a little while ago. I can't remember when it was. And they specifically asked for Congress to get involved. And I think that's helpful. They asked for them to get involved both with regard to stable coins as well as spot market crypto jurisdictions. They also reinforced the fact that the enforcement of the rules that are on the books today should continue. I don't disagree with that. I just think if it's going to continue, this education component is critical. And by that, I mean the regulator educating the innovator as to how they're going to apply their regulations.
Dawn, that's a perfect segue into what I think should be the last question. We have about 8 minutes left, and I want to leave some time for some questions from the audience. As we go forward, and we talked a lot about pessimism today and how slow it's going to take, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in what we're saying because it is a topic on all of Washington's agenda right now to bring that clarity and to make sure that the U.S. is a leader in Web3. If you were talking to, an executive at a company right now who wanted to get in this space and they wanted to engage government, what kind of advice would you give them to go forth and do that?
Yeah. You presume that I was going to have a positive answer. I hate to be negative again. I'll come up with something positive, but I want to impose upon the C-suite and even up to the board of directors in these companies need to have an awareness of the various global regulatory implications, even as messy as they are. And why that's important is your customers are demanding that you provide them with these products and these services. In order to do it, you're going to have to rely on some third-party service providers. And I think that those third-party service providers are the ones who are probably struggling to understand the regulatory structure. And I think that's evidenced by a variety of registration failure findings and recent enforcement actions. And I think companies may find that their service providers are unaware of regulatory obligations. And this is not just the job of the compliance officer. I think there's tremendous opportunity and there are also risk in these offerings, and not just market volatility risk. There's regulatory risk that is real and it's somewhat unprecedented. And I think that everyone in the entire enterprise needs to understand, not everyone in the entire enterprise, everyone who's responsible for the overarching enterprise needs to be spending time understanding their regulatory risk. And they're not always direct regulatory risk. They could be regulatory risk from your service providers. And by service providers, I mean, those who are helping you with your payment systems, those who are helping you with your trading and your hedging and your investment in digital assets. I think there's a lot of question out there as to what their obligations are. And there's no clear education occurring, as we've already established. And I think to the extent that companies who might not frequent agencies like the CFTC or the SEC could really play a critical role in encouraging them to ensure that they're regulatory obligations were made clear to those service providers that you're all going to rely on.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Dawn. We're going to open it up now for some audience questions.
We have time if there is one really short question.
Okay.
Does anybody, nothing came in on Slido. We've got one over here.
In terms of other jurisdictions, seeing this as an opportunity, moving fast and trying to promote company formation or company relocation, like which jurisdictions do you think are out front and trying to seize that opportunity?
Were you able to hear that?
I was. I think France is doing a remarkable job of attracting people, not because they're putting in place relaxed regulations, but because they're putting in place clear regulations and they're inviting people. So that's one example. I think there are many. There are many, and I'm going to hear from people after this. Like, I'm also doing great things in this space. I don't need to suggest everyone. There are many other folks who aren't, but I think France has done a good job of welcoming folks.
I would agree. France in the EU is definitely the lead right now. And you look to the Caribbean, there's a lot of jurisdictions there who are trying to take the lead. Even Africa, what Kenya is doing right now, they're creating their own digital currency. They're moving forward. And then Asia as well. You know, Singapore is really taking the lead there. So there's a lot of jurisdictions all around the world that are seeing this as an opportunity and trying to, you know, move ahead of the US in becoming the regulatory leader of this space.
I agree. I'm proud of Singapore. Good call, Singapore.
Thank you, Dawn. I think the biggest takeaway that we've heard is when it comes to legislation and regulation, change will not happen overnight. Yep. It will happen over time. So thank you, too, for that great conversation. If you have more questions for them, put it in Slido, let us know, put it in the LinkedIn group, and we'll make sure they get answered. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cody. Thank you.